In environmental medicine, we've been suspecting this for decades, but we couldn't really make it out. So what evolved in the last years is almost a scientific scandal.
Welcome back. You're watching the Dr. Nandi Show, and today we're learning more about glyphosate found in the weed killer Roundup. And joining us today is 𝗖𝗵𝗲𝗯, a certified functional medicine practitioner, certified nutrition specialist, herbalist, and an expert on organic farming, environmental management, and restoration. Super smart guy. He's got lots of qualifications. Thank you for joining us today. So why is there such controversy and differing opinions? You've got all these agencies, including the EPA and other agencies, saying everything's fine, others who swear everything is not fine. Tell me what's this controversy about?
So in environmental medicine, we've been suspecting this for decades, but we couldn't really make it out. So what evolved in the last years is almost a scientific scandal. There's hundreds of studies showing that glyphosate is not that toxic. So there's an independent researcher in France, Professor 𝗔𝗕𝗢𝗨𝗧,
yes,
who he actually looked at those studies and he analyzed how they were made, and he analyzed what material was used in those studies. And he basically found out that they were comparing glyphosate in larger amounts with glyphosate in smaller amounts. So if you compare one thing to itself, you will not get the result that you will get if you compare it to nothing or to placebo. So the study was not done in the right way.
So you're saying that the studies often put things in larger concentrations and smaller concentrations, saying that there's no difference in the toxicity, hence it's not toxic. Instead, it should be, in your opinion, that you should say no glyphosate versus some, and what's the difference? And what are some of the studies that show that there's actually damage? Because the company Monsanto, they claim hundreds of studies that show that there's no problems, like you talked about. What about some of the studies that show that there's a problem?
So what we found out over the last years through Professor 𝗔𝗕𝗢𝗨𝗧 and other researchers is that the company claims there's glyphosate, which is the main ingredient, then there's water, and then there are some inert soaps in the product.
Yes.
So it turns out that if you compare glyphosate with nothing, with placebo, it's actually 100 times more toxic than in the studies done by the industry or the independent studies. But if you take the final product Roundup, it's 1,000 times more toxic than glyphosate. So Professor 𝗔𝗕𝗢𝗨𝗧 was wondering, how can this be that a soap makes a chemical 1,000 times more toxic? This doesn't make any sense.
Yes.
Right? So he went back to study it, and he found out that there are hundreds of different chemicals hidden in what is called an inert soap, and nobody has ever studied that. There's no scientific studies on it because it's a soap, and studies are expensive, so why would you waste money on studying soap, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of how it works.
If I can break it down, so basically you've got glyphosate, and they compare glyphosate by itself and say, well, it's not very toxic, but when you put these quote-unquote inert chemicals, so that in English means that, that these things that are in Roundup, people think, well, it's just inert, it doesn't do anything, so let's not even study it. But when you put the glyphosate with it, all of a sudden the combination, maybe you're saying 1,000 times more toxic. And that's what Professor is it 𝗔𝗕𝗢𝗨𝗧?
𝗔𝗕𝗢𝗨𝗧
said. Yeah. And the conclusions that he made were what? How did he do the study himself?
So he was trying to find out logically this doesn't make sense. Soap would not make a single chemical 1,000 times more toxic.
Yeah.
Soap can only help it to get into the cell or maybe spread over the leaf of the plant, right? So he had to analyze these soaps and find out what they are. But these soaps are proprietary, so there's a patent on it, and nobody knows what's in there. So he had to really run it through chemical testing equipment to find out the chemicals in there. And he found there's hundreds, if not thousands, of different chemicals. And it seems as if these soaps are actually derivatives of charred petroleum tar, which is a leftover trash residue of petroleum refinery, mineral oil refinery.
And did he give a hypothesis, a reason why they would put that in there? Is that make the glyphosate more stable?
Yes, so he actually did an experiment where he took 5 plants and he sprayed nothing on the first plant, and the plant was very happy after 3 days. He sprayed glyphosate on the second plant, and that plant looked a little frizzled, but it wasn't dead, and Roundup should work in 3 days. He sprayed 2 different Roundup solutions and the soap on the other plants, and they were all pretty much dead in 3 days. So
including the soap itself, without the glyphosate?
just the soap in briquettes killed the plant within 3 days. So the hypothesis here is that it's actually the soap that's in the soaps are the active ingredients, and glyphosate is kind of just a distraction for the scientists so that nobody realizes how toxic it really is.
Very interesting. And we know that Roundup was used, significantly, but then in the 90s, what happened? Why was it all of a sudden increased in use? What happened?
Yeah, so the Monsanto, as one of the example companies, went to the federal government and said, we've developed these genetically modified plants and they are resistant to Roundup, meaning if we spray the chemical, the weeds will die, but the vegetables will not die. So that means we can spray less chemicals. We don't need that many chemicals. So the federal government said, great, we have all these studies showing it's safe, and you want to use even less of that, so that's amazing. Here you go, plant these plants. So they did. That started in the 1990s. But what happened, and what was unexpected, probably nobody could really expect that, is it seems as if genes from those genetically modified foods transferred out to the weeds, meaning now the weeds didn't die from it either anymore. And then over the course of the last 20, 30 years, the farmers had to spray more and more and more because now the weeds were resistant as well.
Interesting. And so, which is great for the company because then you sell more and more product. Mm-hmm. But as a consequence, and we can talk about and when we come back, as a consequence, you probably have to spray more and more. But you need more plants as well because they would probably also work on the plants. We have to take a break. When we come back, we'll answer that question because the idea, just if you're following, is that what he's saying is that the genes are transferred to the weeds. So the weeds are growing. You need to spray more of this stuff to make sure the weeds don't grow. But then the plants that are there are also going to be affected. You said, when people were spraying, farmers were spraying more and more of the Roundup, the plants that were there that were so quote unquote resistant to being killed by them, it was transferring to the weeds. They spread more Roundup to get rid of the weeds. What happened to the plants? I mean, how are they growing? Are they getting more toxic as well?
It seems like the genetically modified vegetable plants that are bred specifically for that, they are still resistant, even if you spray more. But they needed to find something that would kill the weeds, but not the plants, and it couldn't be glyphosate, or it couldn't be Roundup. So what they had to do, and this was a couple of years ago under the last administration, they lobbied the government to approve a mixture of Roundup and 2,4-D. Do you know what 2,4-D is?
2,4-D was the original way back before, right?
It was an ingredient in Agent Orange.
Yes.
So, and it's way more toxic even than what we're talking about.
And so, most people don't even know these things that are happening, that we're actually having our representatives in Congress approve these kinds of things. And of course, the devil's in the details. So to me, it's, what is happening besides the crops? Absolutely, our crops and food are affected. Where else are these toxins going to?
Well, the problem is that with the Industrial Revolution, we started doing things that had never really been done in nature. So we're burning coal, we're burning mineral oil, we're burning all these things. And that kind of still would be okay if we had filters. But if we don't filter it, mineral oil and coal have been made out of plants. So plants don't like heavy metals. They damage their cells and they damage our cells. So they try to sequester it into the non-living parts like the wood. And when these plants die and they get buried underground, then a lot of pressure turns it into coal and mineral oil, and we're getting that back out from the ground, and we're burning these heavy metals and releasing them into the environment again. And heavy metals don't get destroyed. Once they are there, they're there, and they are very damaging to our cells.
But I think here's an opportunity. We talk about being your own health hero. So we're giving you the information, you look at it, and of course this is just the beginning. Do your own research. And here's the other thing, and he talked about just in the past administration, they lobbied to get a very toxic agent to be put with Roundup and to create a combination. Talk to your representatives, right? We're still a democracy. Talk to your legislators, talk to your senators. Say, you know what? How about studies like Jan was talking about? How about studies that actually talk about not just glyphosate, but Roundup with the quote-unquote inert chemicals that are there? If you ask for it, we still can demand it. And the other thing is, secondly, as consumers, if you start buying stuff that is not sprayed with Roundup, guess what's going to happen? The industry is going to demand that there's changes. That's how you do it. I mean, you can scream and shout and say, you know what, I'm not sure or not. But if you're concerned about yourself or your children and the planet, you can do something about it. We still have a mechanism as consumers, as folks that still vote, to do something about that. Thank you, Jan. I appreciate it for bringing these ideas, to really talk about what's going on instead of kind of the shield. And again, we're not taking sides here, but we just want to give you the information so you can make your own opinion. We have to take a break. Coming up, a cancer expert that testified in the 3 Roundup trials about the link that he sees between cancer and this cocktail that's coming up. Please stay with us. Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Partha Nandi, and if you enjoyed that video, you're going to love the next one. It's full of incredible information to help you start your health hero journey.